Jai Guru, everyone.
Jai Guru.
Jai Guru.
Jai Guru.
Hello and welcome to the Awake Minute by Minute podcast. We're on minute 48. Today we are joined with Anya. How are you, Anya?
Hello, it's fantastic to see you all and to talk about this wonderful film and Yogananda, one of the greatest people of all times.
This is the enthusiasm we desperately need. Anya, tell us a bit about yourself. Where are you from? Where did you meet Guru?
Yeah, so I'm originally from Russia, and right now, obviously, the situation's a bit difficult in the world with Russia, which seems to actually correspond to the minute that we're discussing today, where extreme challenges are there, and it's about what we do as people to get over it. But I've been living in the UK for the last 19 years, and interestingly, I met Guruji while I was here in the UK, and I remember I was searching for something deeper, searching for the meaning, and just not really able to find it anywhere in my immediate, group of friends and acquaintances and what I was studying. And interestingly, it was thanks to my father, who was collecting and trying to get any information that he could about yoga. And this is in the Soviet Union, where everything was completely banned, religion was banned, anything strange or different, of course, was banned. So there was one of the papers that was just passed around between people, and people used to type it up at home on a typewriter and pass it to their friends behind the back. And there was a mention about Kriya Yoga in it, and it wasn't by anybody that I've heard of before in terms of the author of this, but Kriya Yoga was mentioned, and at that point I was researching all the different types of yoga and what was happening, and none of it was making sense. So it didn't make sense why there's this yoga and that yoga, and they just weren't coming together into any meaningful system for me. It was just very bitty and disjointed. And when I saw that word Kriya Yoga, and there was a small description of the powers that it gives people, I thought, oh, okay, well, I haven't heard of this Kriya Yoga. What is it? So I looked it up, and of course, the first thing that comes up when you do a search on the internet is autobiography of a yogi. So I thought, oh, okay, well, that looks interesting. Autobiography of a yogi, that sounds like a cool name. Maybe I'll read that book, and there's a whole chapter on Kriya Yoga in it. Wow, okay, well, let's get into that. And of course, there was a chapter on Kriya Yoga in the book, and it felt like all the questions that I ever had in my head, and I didn't even know I had, were answered in that book, and even things that I hadn't thought of, but obviously were still there inside. So I got the answers for, and that's how it happened.
Amazing. And did you take Kriya soon after? How long did you wait to take lessons and then Kriya?
Yes, it was quite soon. And interestingly, Master talks about cycles of 12 years. So I completed my 2 cycles of 12 years at the age of 24. And then I was given the permission to take Kriya Yoga. So I got my first Kriya Yoga lessons, and I started them just as I turned 25. So that was great.
Amazing.
Yeah, worked out with the timings.
And which language did you read the autobiography in?
In English.
In English.
Yes, in English, because I thought it was originally written in English, so it makes sense to read.
Did you try the Russian? Have you seen the Russian? There must be a Russian translation, right?
Yes, there is. I won't lie, I haven't read it.
No.
I've read other publications.
I wanted to just know like how, because it must be so difficult translating Guruji's writing. So it would have been interesting to hear your take. But tell us about the Awake film. What did you think, excluding this minute, what did you think generally of the film?
Yeah, so I remember when I first saw the film and I was mind blown. There was so much in it. There was so much about Yogananda himself, and some of the things which I didn't know from just reading his books and reading information on the SRF website. You know, for example, these challenges that we'll talk about today that came up, I wasn't aware of them. I was just aware that there were difficulties that he went through, but before the film, I certainly wasn't aware of the extent of those difficulties that he had to go through and how relatable it is to us. So the film was an eye-opener in a lot of ways.
Nice. Chris?
We have people on the podcast, guests like yourself, they come on and they're from all over the world, Brazil and India and North America and so on. Maybe you could tell us a little bit about what life in Russia is like now for SRF and for yoga.
Yeah, so there are groups. So there's definitely a meditation circle, SRF meditation circle in Moscow, so in the capital. It's not very big, I don't think, but I believe that everybody who's in it is very much devoted and interested and willing to serve a lot. They've been doing a lot of work on translating SRF lessons. So, of course, the lessons that I mailed to everybody for home study, they so far have not been available in Russian. So there's been a great deal of work happen with that. And there are always projects going on in terms of translating the other publications as well, to really try and give people the opportunity to access that information. Generally speaking, people in Russia don't speak English very easily, and certainly not in the big cities. That would be a challenge. So having the lessons, having the books available in Russian is certainly going to be a really big step, because I believe that people are quite ready for it, and they have the concept of the soul and spirituality is very much in the culture and the nature of the people there. So I'm quite excited to see that this movement and SRF will certainly become more and more known over there.
Through Guruji's good grace, it will happen.
Yeah.
Well, shall we? Chris, have you got any more, Chris, or should we move to the minute?
No, it's great to hear that, and I think for any listeners, they're not aware really the date actually of which we're recording this on, but it's just beginning of March, and certainly at this time there's been messages with SRF to pray for those in Ukraine and so on. So I'm sure the people through the SRF in Moscow and various places are doing their bit, as Guruji teaches, to pray for others, pray for the humanity and for the world. So It's great to hear that they're somewhat established and growing.
Yeah.
Yes. So this minute, as Anya says, is really about the difficulties. Again, we have, I'll just summarize, we have Stephanie Simon, and she says something interesting which I want to discuss. On the one hand, we have open-minded Americans that revere him, but his unorthodox ways, raise the ire of conservatives. And then when he went to Deep South, things really hit a high fever pitch. And then there's all these headlines about all the scandal that happened with Swami Dhirananda. Swami is ordered to leave Miami and all that kind of stuff. And then there's Varun Soni, who says Yogananda's relationship with the community has now changed. He's no longer being invited to have the key to the city, but he's, now have to really defend himself a lot in his position. And then the narrator, Anubhav Kher, says that, and Yogananda says that he was suffering the severest trial of his life at that time, and that the newspapers had lied and done lots of unsavory, immoral media publications and reporting, which are quite damaging. But let's frame this minute. So in minute 46, two episodes ago, we discussed the incident and the aftermath in some detail. The whole incident with Swami Dhirananda, and the big fight that was happening at Mother Center. And this one just talks about it in slightly more detail in terms of how the local community reacted to him. But again, we discussed this in minute 46. So firstly, I just wanted to talk about the fact that, was there a need for the film to further re-emphasize this dark patch? Because they already did a good job of it 2 minutes ago, I'd say. They could have filled in those little gaps about how the community reacted in that minute. But in my mind, the classical storytelling of arc of everything's hunky-dory, and then there's a bit of a travesty, there's a bit of adversity, and you have to overcome those things. And Guruji obviously did do that, and then everything's overcome at the end, and that's the story. So they kind of they brought in some adversity and then brought it in again. And then, so they really try to pull the audience and make sure, in my mind, that their attention is retained. What do you think, Mike?
I'm glad they did it, because it kind of adds for the viewer, it is easier now to see how Guruji really lived. And I feel like SRF, they chose on purpose not to make the film themselves, but to have the film made by a third party, by independent filmmakers, because it is essentially a documentary. And documentaries, I feel like their purpose is to actually show all the details and not just leave anything out. Like we said earlier, that Guruji, because he is very humble, left a lot of his struggles out of the autobiography of a yogi, like his struggles that he had financially, that he never mentioned the conflicts that he had with devotees, and he just mentioned all the things that he found meaningful in his life. And in a documentary, it's different. And I feel like, as a viewer, if you only knew the autobiography before, of course, like Anya said earlier, you have those moments where you go like, oh my God, he went through some real struggles. But I feel like also the viewer deserves to know that.
Chris?
They were similar to my thoughts, really. I think it's viewer specific, isn't it? This is for a wider audience, not only for the SRF devotees. There are a lot of things that aren't in the autobiography of a yogi and in the teachings of Guruji, or even in discussed in the centers. And I think in some ways it's healthy to know some of the struggles that Guruji had. And I was reading one of the chapters in the Bhagavad Gita with Yogananda's commentary on that. I think it was 12:17 and 12:16 maybe. And it was saying really how there's delusion and illusion in the world, and you're going to be trialed and tested, and it's going to be really, really strong, right? So you have to be really sure, fast, and steadfast on your path, and it's kind of reassuring to know that even as accomplished as Guruji is, clearly. He had his fair share of troubles, and he really did feel them as we feel them. He processed them in some way that we process them, and that's, for me, I take some inspiration to say, hey, no matter how high you might travel in your spiritual path, there will be challenges, and I think that is a general misconception, not to go into too much of spirituality. It's all roses and singing and things like this, but it's kind of life on fast forward, and you're going to get these obstacles that you need to move around. And Guruji was well placed to do it, and he did it with grace as well. which is something that's really, really nice to see. So
yeah, there's lessons for us to pick up on through his whole life, even when things aren't going plain sailing, isn't it, Mike?
Yeah, like I just wanted to add to what Chris said, that he, even in the face of adversity, he never backed down. He like, you could have thought that, oh my God, there's so many bad things happening, let's adjust course or something, but he would always confront all the adversities head on and eventually solve them.
Yeah. So Lisa at the start of the minute says that, you know, Guruji, his unorthodox views didn't sit well with the conservative population amongst parts of the community. So I wanted to find out, you know, just do a bit of research on what kind of views they might have taken issue to. Anya, do you want to read out something that I found there, and we'll discuss that kind of thing?
Yes, I believe it's about the Kundalini force, the serpent force, that has been mentioned in a couple of the newspaper article clippings that they give in the film. So what we have here about this is that the coiled creative life force at the base of the astral spine, or Kundalini, has always been symbolized as a serpent. And when this creative force is asleep in delusion, it flows down and outwards and feeds all the senses. Uncontrolled, its stinging venom causes insatiable lusts. But when the pure Kundalini force is awakened by the yogi, it rises to the brain and is transformed into the bliss of spirit. And this uplifting current, serpentine current, is Vasuki, the supreme force for human liberation. So, of course, it didn't help that the Kundalini was referred to as the serpent energy. And this, obviously, for most people, would have elicited the images of Satan in the Garden of Eden.
Yeah. And the controversial thing in my mind when I found this, firstly, obviously, lust is there in the Christianity and in the Genesis story in the Garden of Eden. But in here, it's kind of saying that we can use that serpent, Satan, basically, in a traditional Christian's reading of this text. We can use that Satan force and actually use it for our own spiritual unfoldment, as in raise our energies. And I think that, in my mind, is what really would have you know, some conservative Christians that are not so open-minded with interpretations of their scripture wouldn't have liked that. Mike?
Yeah, and we must see where the word serpent comes from, like from the Old Testament, right? And that was probably a time when technology wasn't very highly evolved, and Moses wasn't able to talk about energy and stuff to his people. No, he just said, you have to imagine it like a snake, or like so they understand what it means. And then Christianity 2000 years later, or even more in the case of Moses, we're still using those same words, and then they kind of have, like you said, attributed to different meanings, like mostly to Satan, right? And the whole idea that you as a being can ascend and can be merged one with God is not there in Christianity. So I feel like that's kind of the disconnect.
Chris?
I've heard that whenever, you know, higher celestial beings want to come onto the planes of the earth, they might use the bodies of snakes, which is kind of interesting to think of, because they're so connected with the earth itself. They can feel tremors, you know, from, you know, movements of the earth from you know, many miles out and things like this. And so you know, snakes are maybe quite magical you know, creatures, and I suppose we think of them as crawling on their bellies, like I think the Bible talks about that, isn't it? How they effectively, it was sort of punished for its sins, right? And its ability to be able to maybe walk on the earth was taken away, so it had to crawl, because it deserved to crawl, and these kind of things. So yeah, I think the more you educate yourself on these matters and see different perspectives, you see how kind of insane some of these connotations are with the snake. So yeah.
Anya.
Yes, I also had a thought where I would imagine it would have been very unusual for people in the 20s to be told anything about the creative force or the sex force or the control of the sex force. And of course, Master did talk about those things in his lectures, in the sense of the Kundalini, of where the people's energy was flowing, whether it was into the senses and creating lust, therefore, or whether it was reversing that and using that very strong power to create self-realization. I would imagine that nobody, and especially back then, would have expected to hear anything about the sex force in a religious or a science of religion context of these lectures that they went to.
Yep. And the culture at the time was a bit of a strange one, actually, in terms of discrimination, especially in the South. For example, there was a book titled Mother India that was written by a historian called Catherine Meyer, and become a bestseller in 1927. But it was condemned by Tagore, Gandhi, and basically any educated or well-known Indian, because it gave a very poor portrayal, like a dishonest, distorted portrayal of like India and the people as like untrustworthy and immoral, and her representation of India as a land of filth and disease and sexual perversion. So these are the kind of like battles that some people had to tackle in terms of their views of that part of the world. And obviously Guruji is openly about that kind of thing. So these are the kind of and Chris, what were you going to say?
Sure. We've talked about it in previous minutes, in recent ones as well, that Guruji was really, he had a congregation of women. A lot of women would have shown up for whatever reasons. At the time, it was quite popular for a woman to show up, and he was talking to women about this. So imagine, in the previous minutes we talked about it, where Brown Mystic has a woman throwing herself at his feet, doing a pranayama and things like this. To those who were ignorant of some of these truths, it would have been so shocking to have a foreigner that you've never seen before. You've never seen somebody with the color of his skin coming to your lands, and it would have been seen as their land because they'd recently maybe fought for that land, and it would have been very very divided. Talking to what they would have seen as their woman about sex and sexual energy, using this sexual energy. It would have been so absurd, I think. And I talked about it last minute. I actually have sympathy for the ignorance of people at that time, because it would have been super challenging. Yeah, and this was all before women's rights and things like that. So yeah, a big shift, and very bold for him to do that.
Yeah, and that would have contributed that. So the kind of negative culture amongst some people's minds, and that would have contributed to some of the fallout, mention of all this stuff. Yeah.
Yeah, no, not at all.
Chris?
Yeah, my only comment really on this is it's an awesome comparison, but conventional wisdom somewhat lets people down over the years, where there's crowd thinking that's awash with ignorance. So yeah, it's something that's shocking how long it took to unravel, but also inspiring that we did unravel it to a very good extent. But it took real leaders in the field to really break that through. And you can probably name a few of them, but Martin Luther King comes to mind, and how much of a beacon of light was he, and his message was so graceful and loving. trying to get rights, equal rights and things like that for people. And that is some time after Guruji was, walking, doing his problems and troubles, having all those things. So, yeah.
Yeah, Mike?
Yeah, so one thing I thought when I saw the movie scene was that maybe Guruji had maybe exactly the same thing happen to him. Like he was the star of a show, and then he couldn't even dine there in the same place, right? This is not super unrealistic, right? That this could have happened, and he probably never mentioned it to anybody. Because my second point is that he didn't really care that much about his ego in those kind of situations, probably, right? Like his focus was on the organization that he built, and he didn't want those things let even a little bit diminish his work that he came to do, right? So he didn't want any kind of problems escalate to an extent that they would interfere with his work. That was always number one for him.
Yeah. Anya?
I thought that essentially he's almost answered this question in the letter that comes up at the end of the minute, where he says, I know that if I stick with the truth and fight a good fight, victory will and must come.
Very good, Anya. You paused it, didn't you? And then you zoomed in. You're going to be a podcast regular now. I think we're going to have you. You're the only one that's done this, Anya. This is great stuff.
But brilliant. But the answers are there. He tells us the answers, as he always does tell us the answers.
It's true.
But,
Truth. I was gonna discuss that, but yeah, we might as well discuss that now. So, fighting the good fight. So I remember when I was young, I used to take this to heart. Really go to town if there's the right moral basis for something that I'm doing. I just like make sure that I do it, even if it's like self-defeating in the scenario that I'm in. Like if it makes more enemies than friends, but I'd still do it because it's the right thing to do. Yeah, but no, it's so well put in this letter. I don't know who this letter is to, but perhaps the Lewis's. Yeah, it's got a the letter that Annie talks about has got loads of notes and scribbles all over it. It's half typewritten, and he talks about the chaos that the papers are doing. The love cult and all that kind of stuff. Chris.
Reading this letter and zooming in and seeing all the details there, and going through this documentary bit by bit, and you mentioned at the beginning of this recording, Priyank, you wonder, did they go into too much detail almost? Have they dwelled on some of the things? And I would say not, because it's actually really instructive to look at Guruji's life and the genuine troubles that he had, and as close as he would have come to failure. And it says, in this letter here, that he's having we are having a little tough time of it here because of adverse conditions financially and all the diabolical acts of those who would ruin me. And those are strong words, and he doesn't mince his words. He clearly was facing troubles that were existential threats, to the organization. And it made me think, like, how close was this, to not be happening, but more important to my mind is how perfect timing is it that Guruji, came and just kind of made it through the veil of success and failure and established something like the SRF, and had the teachings of Kriya Yoga, brought to the earth, where it came from, his gurus through, time that have been disseminated to each line of his gurus. And it made me think, how many times in the course of history have other teachers like Guruji come and tried to bring something like this and failed, and the local population haven't allowed them to establish teachings like this because of the darkness of ignorance and Maya that existed at the time. So he's kind of just punching through that veil at an opportune time. And I talk about a lot about the yugas and things like that. It's it's really obviously been a tough time to do it even now. And I wonder, 10 years before, 50 years before, would it have been possible? Who knows?
Mike?
Did you read that handwritten note after that one paragraph where he says it is all about SD? That's probably Swami Dhirananda, right? And then he says, poor soul, he has to, I don't know, append more than I dreamed. And then it says blackmailers. So he still, even in this scene, he has like compassion with Swami Dhirananda, right? That because he was obviously Yogananda and his work were talked about in the press, but he was like the main target at this point, right? As well, right?
Yeah, let's talk about that. So fighting the good fight. So I mentioned that author that, that published this book called Mother India that was just, very, very poor in terms of its outlook on India and racism and things like that. So, Yogananda actually when he was defending his position, he didn't just fight the good fight for his own organization. He actually brought in these other elements. So, for example, this is what he wrote in the Daily Mail, the Miami Daily News. He wrote, I teach the formation of character and highest moral teachings in self-discipline, both to married and unmarried people. And in return, I get the name of a leader of a love cult. And this in spite of the fact that there is not the slightest foundation for it. And then he talks about the the basis of self-realization fellowship, or what he's trying to achieve in terms of spirituality, and then he really defends India and how the history of India and the really discredits the book that so he's not just, my point was, he's not just focused on his own little battle. He's focused on this far greater battle, which is like how racism is impacting the whole community in that time, which I thought was quite impressive and interesting. Yeah, Chris.
I suppose I was going to jump in to say I agree with you. I think fighting the good fight is we can't underestimate how difficult it is to be objective, and we have various layers of perception of ignorance that we see the world through, and that clouds our ability to see things objectively and then for truth. And Guruji, as powerful as he was, he faced that as strongly as anybody might face it. So yeah, the objective truth is one thing, and then everything else is deviations from it. And yeah, he faced that with full force.
Yeah, and let's see how he managed the corporate image kind of management for SRF. So I found a little quite interesting article there. So Swami Dhirananda, he said, I now have a secretary sit outside the door when I talk to anyone in my room, and the door is never closed. And then Phil Goldberg says, such changes were no doubt made in collaboration with or at the behest of Yogananda. And in segments of correspondence quoted in newspapers, he warned Dhirananda to avoid even the appearance of impropriety with women. And I just find that that is executive level management, isn't it? PR, and in terms of managing the image, managing the situation, stopping it from escalating and getting worse in any way. That's that you pay PR consultants a lot of money nowadays for that kind of stuff, and Guruji is kind of orchestrating it just as a yogi. Yeah, Mike.
Yeah, and this sounds a bit weird maybe now, but this might also be a cultural difference between India, maybe also other parts of the world, like Europe, for example, and America, where in America, appearance counts as much more than in any other place, I would say. And so having a consultant that always makes sure you say the right thing, you do the right thing, I feel like this is part of the American culture of like the movie stars and all those kind of things, like that their appearance very carefully crafted, more so than in other cultures, I think.
Chris?
This all shows me how pragmatic Guruji was. Yeah, and he had this level of spiritualism that is exemplary. but he also kind of walked the walk. You know, you talk about fighting the good fight. You know, he was extremely pragmatic and savvy. You know, that's a good move. And a necessary one in the battle, let's say, that he was kind of facing at the time, to navigate these waters, to do what was necessary. It's an unfortunate reality, of course, that, you know, people aren't a little bit more trusting or truthful or whatever it might be. But you know, Yogananda is definitely, you know, is head, you know, if you want to use an analogy, in the clouds, but his feet in the ground. You know, he's able to walk both in be in both worlds, which is really cool and inspiring to see again.
To live in this world, but be not of it. Is that quote?
That's the better way.
Yeah.
Anya, any reflections on PR? I'm sure you have to manage a lot of that in your profession.
Yes, well, I think I mean, I never really thought about these points that you've just raised, that he also had all the PR and all the image of SRF to restore. But we can certainly see that he did a lot of that, and I presume that those years that we're talking about are exactly the beginning of it. And I would say that all the changes that he's implemented for how sort of SRF and its monastics and leaders look to others, it's so spotless, and it's been so based on the spiritual principles that now, 100 years on, it still stands. And for me personally, that was one of the big attractions of SRF, was that there was never any ambiguity, and it was always very clear that it was about what it was about. You know, it was very clear to me that there was no room for any kind of what those people were worried for, the love cult or the love abuse or abuse of you know, trusting emotional women, I guess, who come to an organization for spiritual development. And SRF is certainly certainly an organization where that's been completely clear cut, very obvious, and there's never been any doubt with that. We've all heard of various different organizations, spiritual organizations with leaders, which unfortunately over the years then transpired that there was abuse happening, and a lot of, you know, abuse of power to I guess in the sexual ways. But SRF has certainly managed to establish their own you know, the way that they come across, and it's always very clear and that makes it safe. It makes it safe for people to approach it as well. I guess that time that Guruji had to go through himself was actually very necessary for the organization, because that's what led to all this clarity for the next 100 and the next 100 years and the next 100 years. It would have been a lot more difficult, I guess, for the organization of this magnitude to go through a scandal after Master's time. So after he left the body, it would have been much more difficult. But he really laid those foundations right from the beginning. So actually, in a way, even though it might sound a bit strange, but in a way, I'm glad that it happened then, and that they dealt with it then, but and set out the foundations for the time to come.
That is fantastic and brilliant insight there, because I always wondered why I always got annoyed. Self-realization fellowship is so risk averse. It doesn't really do risky things in terms of like media, in terms of lots of things. We were very, very restricted, and I always thought that as a weakness. But now that I'm hearing your insight and these scandals and keeping the teachings pure, and, you know, even at the cost of sometimes like not being able to grow as much as other organizations grow, because they're keeping everything like, you know, there's not much room for like things to leak out that way, and things, the ship has been like anchored by Guruji through all these experiences, and perhaps he even orchestrated them in a way that this is now how we want this organization to run. So Anya, that is some pretty brilliant analysis. We need to have you on again, I think, Anya.
Well, at least you get a little bit the female perspective of a person who joins a spiritual organization.
Indeed. Chris?
Yeah, I agree with Priyank. It's very apt, and we know that even fairly recently, the SRF are still kind of tying up some issues that they've had for many, many years. You know, so even, you know, during Yogananda's times, there's been issues that have kind of been kicked. The can has been kicked on the road. You know, people have pursued issues with him, and they're kind of settling. They're coming to some settlement. You know, 80 years on or so on. But I like Guruji's attitude towards this, yeah, and I think you're quite right, Anya, in how you depict it. And you could almost give an example here in this letter that you can see where in the last paragraph he talks about Miami being a lovely city, and as far as the city itself and the weather is concerned, one could not ask for better. And I only wish that you and those near and dear to you were here to enjoy it with me. So he's already kind of, you know, he's on that positive tilt, even when dealing with such issues and having such problems. He's still saying, you know, there's positivity in lovely weather and friendship and kindness and being with other people. So that, I mean, that's a good example of, I think, how you approach things. That yes, this is like a boil that you must, you know, deal with, and life continues.
Mike?
Yeah, and I also wanted to say that this is a really good point, Anya, that he dealt with it himself. He had those problems himself, right? Imagine those kind of problems of love, like the allegations of the love cult would have come after Master's time. And people would have said, yeah, Master was great, and then it went downhill afterwards, right?
Yeah.
So he put down the foundation of how the kind of publicizing in the organization has to work, and that he basically had this super strong integrity that he could use as leverage. And I feel like he took some weight off the successors like that. Yeah,
that's so true. And also the legal battles, because obviously there was this media craziness that went on, and so this PR exercise or repair work that Guruji had to do. But the legal battles certainly did prepare Self-Realization Fellowship for what was to come, right? With this whole, you know, Ananda massive legal battle, and I'm sure they've had lots of others that we don't know about. But from the outset and through Guruji's, so they would have actually been able to draw inspiration through how Guruji himself dealt with the colossal legal battles that they had when they didn't have much money. You know, this was at a time, I don't think, when James Lind was around. So he would have had to really struggle financially to meet these legal costs, because they didn't have that influx of money that James Lind had. I think that's a good analysis of the adversities that he went through, and really good insight, fascinating insight, Anya. Thank you for sharing that, and Mike and Chris as well, your reflections. The other image in this minute, there's 3 or 4 other images and one moving image. One of them is of Guruji like purposefully walking towards the camera. Nice video in like a garden. Heaven only knows what they used that for. But I think it's a good, it's apt, because this is not something that brought Self-Realization Fellowship to its knees or anything like that, because this just around this time he went to see President Coolidge. So this is just something that was happening kind of in the background, or in one small part of the media in one small state. So this wasn't, you know, all encompassing. There weren't students. I doubt there were lesson students in Boston that were like, oh no, should we now, what are we going to do? We're rudderless. There's none of that. I'm sure there was none of that. This is just Guruji managed this. So that video of him, I think, is a good representation of keep calm, everyone. Guruji is at the helm. And then there's two images of him kind of looking in the distance, and I suppose they portray like the severest trials. So no doubt they would have been challenges for Guruji, even though he's more than capable of meeting those challenges, and he was, obviously, because as we'll find out in a future minute, he was cleared, or Self-Realization Fellowship was cleared of all allegations, and they were, it was actually the media that had done some terrible spin doctoring. And that is pretty much the minute. I think it was a very good discussion. I think there's with this minute, we personally, I know you guys disagree with me, but as a biased devotee, I'd rather read about this and have them compress this in 1 minute, and then have, for example, more time on Gandhi. Or like on Rabindranath Tagore, like they didn't talk about that. He went to go see Tagore in the Autobiography of Yogi. Imagine if they'd replaced a representation of him and Tagore with this airtime. Anyway, Mike.
I agree with you on the Tagore thing. Like they didn't spend too much time on this. I feel like anyways, but it was just such a break in the rest of, like, the movie was all positive, and then suddenly those few minutes that they talk about this, I feel like get super amplified. And they also added it to the trailer, and it's like you said, and it's like Varun Soni said, right? Like they needed a kind of drama part of the movie, and so they threw this in. Yeah, but if they would have talked about about Tagore and his schools and how they talked about it, it would have been fascinating. Maybe that could be a film of its own.
Should we start one, Mike?
Yes.
We can get your sister involved. I'm sure we can make it happen.
Good.
We've got too many things in the frying pan, haven't we? Not enough space left. Anyway, Chris.
I disagree. I'll hold the disagree card. No, I would make I suppose the argument that this was a real challenge. This was a real threat to, Guruji said it was, a real testing time for him. And when we don't hear about it as devotees really in many places for good reasons. But it's reality. This is a good slap in the face of what it would have been like back, 100 years ago, not that long ago. And as I said, the thin veil between success and failure, it's ambiguous. And as Guruji said, he's fighting a good fight, and it's inevitable that he's going to win because that's the idea between light and darkness. But I think it's good to have it in there. I think it's good for people to know that this isn't just all roses and there was a good struggle to establish something that's so great. So it's a good dose of reality.
Anya, what are your final reflections? And at the start of this podcast, you mentioned this theme is apt for the current scenario in the world in terms of the war that's happening, and all your reflections.
Yeah, so as a quick reflection on how much time and space this theme was given in the film, I also think it's probably quite good, because the film wasn't intended to be a representation of just the book. It was intended to be a bit different, something else, something that wasn't purely from SRF. And it did allow us to get a little glimpse into the difficulties that Master actually had, that sometimes we just hear that, oh yes, he had difficulties. but we don't always appreciate the extent of those difficulties. And so I found that it was very beneficial for my development to know that, oh, it was that bad for him. You know, sometimes when we go through a bad patch in our life, we think that our situation is dire, is terrible, and nobody else has gone through that. But when you see this in the film, it really makes you feel not so much alone. You know that Master also had that, and the extent of that, and you really get an appreciation of how difficult it was, and yet he was still able to get through it, which is exactly what he wants us to do. So in that sense, I'm quite happy with what they've done in the film. I think it's good. And as a reflection on what's happening now, so of course with the war happening, one nation attacking another nation, after being friends and after being so closely tied for such a long time, it's, of course, it's sad to see that that's happening. And it really ties with what Master went through, with everybody was against him. There was betrayal, there was difficulty, there was a financial crisis for him. And there was the press creating the wars, really. That's what is mentioned in the film by Master himself. He says, look at what the yellow press has created, essentially, and a lot of that is what we see in the world now as well, where we know that every conflict has been set on fire a lot by the media, just representing their own interests. And it just really helps to reflect that, yes, while there is all this going on with the media, with the war creation, and yet we can still rise above it. We can still fight the good fight on the side of spirit rather than matter, which pulls us down.
Yeah, Brother Dhirananda gave a lovely vlog about the power of prayer, and we'll close with a prayer, but yeah, the importance of prayer cannot be underestimated, because through our, for example, Gandhi said, be the change you wish to see in the world, and you have to be that light as well. I mean, you can't underestimate the influence that we can have, not just through our, through how we behave, but actually our prayer and our affirmation.